And what are we to do with this one, Your Honor? The docket says Jane Doe, but the charge sheet says it all. Vagrancy, resisting arrest, public nuisance. The state sees a woman with no name, no home, and no discernible contribution to the society whose laws she so flagrantly disrespects. She offers no defense, no explanation, just silence. A silence that, I might add, speaks volumes about her guilt and her contempt for this court. The words of Assistant District Attorney Marcus Davies slice through the stale air of Courtroom 4B, each syllable dripping with a polished, performative disdain. The jury, a collection of weary citizens already convinced by the defendant's disheveled appearance, shifted uncomfortably, their gazes a mixture of pity and revulsion. They saw what Davies wanted them to see, a problem to be processed, a piece of human debris washed up on the steps of the courthouse. They saw tangled, matted hair, a threadbare army surplus jacket far too large for a thin frame, and hands calloused and dirty, resting with an unnerving stillness on the polished oak of the defendant's table. They saw a ghost, a hollowed-out vessel. The gallery murmured in agreement, the sound a low, sibilant hiss of collective judgment. But Judge Rear Admiral, Rhett Wallace saw something else. He saw the stillness. It wasn't the defeated slump of the guilty or the agitated twitching of the nervous. It was a dense, weighted calm, an economy of energy that was almost predatory. And he saw her posture. Beneath the worn jacket, her back was ramrod straight, a perfect, disciplined line from the base of her skull to her spine, a posture drilled into muscle and bone by years of relentless, unforgiving repetition. It was the posture of a warrior at rest. Wallace narrowed his eyes, a flicker of an old memory stirring, a ghost from a past life of steel decks and salt spray. Davies, however, saw only an easy win, a chance to pontificate. He gestured grandly toward the silent woman. This is the result of a life of bad choices, a burden on our city's resources. What value does a person like this offer? What protection can she claim from a society she so clearly rejects? The prosecutor's voice boomed with sanctimonious certainty, a symphony of arrogance and assumption. The silent woman did not flinch. She did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the far wall, her breathing even, her expression a perfect, unreadable mask of neutrality. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a fortress, and within its walls, a lifetime of discipline held fast against the siege of insults. The public defender, a young, overwhelmed man named Peterson, shuffled his papers, his protest a weak, reedy sound swallowed by Davies' prosecutorial thunder. He had tried to get her to speak, to give him anything to work with, but had received only quiet, monosyllabic refusals. He had resigned himself to the inevitable guilty verdict. The air in the room was thick with certainty, a foregone conclusion waiting only for the formality of a gavel's fall. But the judge remained silent, his gaze locked on the defendant, a nagging question echoing in the chambers of his mind. He had seen that stillness before, in places where silence meant survival and a single wasted movement meant death. He had seen it in the eyes of the men and women who walked the razor's edge between worlds, the quiet professionals who did the nation's hardest work in the darkest of nights. He leaned forward slightly, his judicial robes rustling like dry leaves, a deep, unsettling feeling growing his gut that everyone in this room, especially the confident Mr. Davies, was making a terrible, terrible mistake. If he believed that true strength is found in silence, not volume, type competence below. The trial, if one could call it that, proceeded as a monologue of condemnation. Davies paraded 2 police officers to the stand, both of whom recounted the defendant's arrest with a weary air of professional obligation. They described finding her sleeping in an alley behind a bakery, the smell of stale bread and refuse clinging to the air. They spoke of her refusal to move, her refusal to speak, her refusal to even acknowledge their authority. One officer described the resisting arrest charge, detailing how she had simply gone limp, becoming dead weight, a passive but infuriatingly effective form of noncompliance. It took 3 of us to get her into the cruiser, the officer testified, his voice tinged with a memory of frustration. It was like trying to move a statue. No fear, no anger, Just nothing. Davies seized on this, pacing before the jury box with the theatrical flair of a seasoned performer. Nothing. That's the key word, ladies and gentlemen. Avoid. An absence of civic duty, of personal responsibility, of basic human decency. This isn't a cry for help. It's a statement of defiance. A silent, arrogant refusal to participate in the society that, despite her best efforts, still provides the very pavement she sleeps on and the very air she breathes. He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle over the room. The defendant, still silent, still motionless, seemed to be the only person in the room unaffected by his rhetoric. Her focus was absolute, her gaze unwavering. It was as if she were observing a complex tactical problem from a great distance, detached and analytical. The narrator could almost imagine the thoughts behind those calm, clear eyes, not of fear or shame, but of assessment. She was cataloging the room. The two bailiffs, one older and slightly out of shape, the other younger, more alert, but his hand resting casually on his sidearm, not gripping it. The locations of the exits, the composition of the gallery, the slight tremor in the public defender's hand as he poured a glass of water. She was mapping the human terrain, a process as instinctive to her as breathing. This silent, meticulous inventory was a stark contrast to the loud, empty certainty of the prosecutor. Davies continued his assault, building a caricature of the defendant as a dangerous, unpredictable transient. He painted her silence not as a symptom of trauma or a personal choice, but as a calculated insult to the court's authority. He was building a cage of words, and with each sentence, the bars grew stronger, trapping the jury's perception of the woman in the box. "We must send a message," he declared, his voice rising to a crescendo. "A message that this city will not tolerate such blatant disregard for its laws and its people. A message that says if you will not be a part of our society, you will be removed from it." The jury nodded, their faces grim masks of civic duty. They saw the problem exactly as Davies had framed it. They saw a weed to be pulled. They did not see the hands resting on the table, hands that knew the precise pressure needed to field strip a rifle in total darkness or set a dislocated joint. They did not see the eyes that could read the subtle shift of a shadow at 200 yards or the micro-expressions on a hostile's face. They saw a homeless woman. They saw a nuisance. And in their collective, uncritical judgment, they were about to convict a hero. The judge watched it all unfold, his unease solidifying into a cold certainty. The prosecutor's arguments were built on a foundation of sand, on the arrogant assumption that what he saw was all there was. Wallace knew better. The most dangerous things in the world were often the most unassuming. He had learned that lesson in Blood and Fire, a world away from this sterile, predictable courtroom. He was waiting, though he didn't know for what. He was waiting for the truth to find its voice, unaware that it would soon speak not in words, but in a display of devastating, undeniable action. The moment arrived not with a lawyer's objection, but with a violent splintering of wood and a collective, terrified scream. The side door to the courtroom, a rarely used entrance for staff, burst inward, kicked off its hinges with a single, explosive impact. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, wild-eyed and shaking, his face a mask of furious desperation. In his right hand, he held a large, semi-automatic pistol, waving it erratically at the stunned occupants of the room. Panic detonated. The gallery erupted into a stampede of shrieking, scrambling bodies, people tripping over one another in a frantic bid for the main exit. The jury dove under their table, a clumsy cascade of limbs and terrified gasps. The younger bailiff, caught completely by surprise, fumbled for his weapon, his hand shaking, his training momentarily lost in a flood of adrenaline. The older bailiff froze, his face a pale sheet of shock. Davies, the man of booming words and unshakable confidence, was reduced to a sputtering, cowering figure, hiding behind his lectern like a child hiding from monster. In the heart of this swirling chaos, one person remained a fixed point of absolute calm. For Commander Anya Sharma, the world did not speed up, it slowed down to a crawl. The cacophony of screams faded into a dull, distant roar. Her mind, a finely honed instrument of threat assessment, processed the scene with cold, crystalline clarity. One hostile, male, agitated, high on adrenaline, poor trigger discipline. Weapon is a Glock 19 standard capacity magazine. Grip is unstable, suggesting unfamiliarity with the weapon. Primary target appears to be the judge's bench. Collateral risk high. Bailiff's response time compromised. Window of opportunity 3 seconds, maybe 4. Time seemed to stretch. Each microsecond a vast plane of possibility. She saw the gunman's eyes, wide and unfocused, darting around the room, landing on the judge. She saw his knuckles whiten as he tightened his grip, the first sign of a decision to fire. She rose from her chair. It was not a sudden movement. It was a fluid, deliberate unfolding, like a blade being unsheathed. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. Every muscle fiber, every synapse fired in perfect, practiced harmony. Her threadbare jacket, a symbol of her anonymity, now served as perfect camouflage for her motion. The gunman, his attention locked on the judge, didn't even register her. She took 2 steps forward, her bare feet making no sound on the linoleum floor. Her path was a perfect, calculated angle of intersection, a line of lethal geometry. Davies, peering over his lectern, saw her move and thought she was insane, a madwoman walking into the line of fire. He didn't understand. He couldn't comprehend that he was not witnessing an act of suicide, but an act of supreme, violent competence. He was about to learn the profound difference between the person he thought she was and the person she had always been. The lesson would be delivered in less than 2 seconds. Her body was the weapon. Her mind was the targeting system. As the gunman began to swing the pistol's muzzle toward Judge Wallace, Anya closed the final 5 feet of distance. Her left hand, moving with blurring speed, shot out not for the gun but for the wrist holding it. Her grip was not one of brute strength, but of anatomical precision. Her thumb found the radial nerve bundle on the inside of his forearm, and she applied a sudden, shocking spike of pressure. The gunman's entire arm went numb, his fingers spasming open involuntarily. The Glock clattered to the floor, a loud, metallic sound in the suddenly silent room. In the same seamless motion, her right hand struck his throat. Not a punch, but a rigid, open-handed chop to the vagus nerve beside the larynx. It wasn't a killing blow. It was a biological off-switch. The man's eyes rolled back in his head as his blood pressure plummeted, his body instantly deprived of the ability to support its own consciousness. He crumpled to the ground like a marionette with its strings cut, landing in a boneless heap at her feet. The entire sequence, from her first step to the gunman's unconscious collapse, had taken less time than it took for the gallery's first scream to fully echo off the chamber walls. And then a new kind of silence fell. It was not the quiet of an orderly courtroom. It was a profound, deafening vacuum, a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. Every person left in a room, the judge, the bailiffs, the prosecutor, the huddled jury, was frozen, staring. They stared at the neutralized gunman on the floor. They stared at the discarded pistol lying inert a few feet away. But most of all, they stared at the homeless woman. She stood over the unconscious form, her posture once again perfectly balanced, her breathing slow and even. Her hands, which had just moved with such devastating efficiency, now hung loosely at her sides. She was no longer a defendant. She was a sentinel. Her gaze swept the room one final time, checking for further threats, her eyes lingering for a moment on the trembling bailiffs, a look that was not accusatory, but simply analytical. Finding the room secure, her shoulders relaxed by a fraction of an inch, the only outward sign of the combat adrenaline leaving her system. Davies slowly rose from behind his lectern, his face slack-jawed, his carefully constructed world of rhetoric and prejudice shattered into a million pieces. The vagrant, the nuisance, the burden on society had just, in the space of 3 seconds, demonstrated a level of skill and composure that was utterly, terrifyingly inhuman. He uttered the only words he could form, a weak, strangled whisper that was barely audible in the tomb-like quiet. That's not possible. Judge Wallace, however, knew exactly what he had just seen. It was not impossible. It was simply elite. It was the brutal, beautiful and unmistakable signature of a Tier 1 operator. Judge Wallace's voice cut through the stunned silence like a ship's horn in a dense fog. Bailiffs, secure that weapon and restrain that man. Now, his command jolted the two officers out of their paralysis. They moved with a newfound, slightly frantic energy, one cuffing the unconscious gunman while the other carefully bagged the pistol as evidence. The judge's eyes, however, never left the woman standing in the center of the room. He had seen the technique she used, the precise nerve strike, the fluid economy of motion. It was not the brawling of a street fighter or the standard training of a police officer. It was a specific, highly advanced form of combat, taught in only one place to a very select few. He finally understood the reason for his unease, the source of the nagging familiarity. It was the quiet, the stillness, the absolute mastery of self that he had just witnessed. He banged his gavel once, a sharp, authoritative crack that seemed to reset the reality of the room. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice hard as granite, addressing the bewildered public defender. "Your client's personal effects, the ones taken from her when she was booked. I want them brought to this courtroom immediately." Peterson, looking utterly lost, could only nod and relay the order to a court clerk who scurried out of the room. Davies remained frozen, his face a pale mask of disbelief, his entire case, his entire worldview, having been dismantled by 2 seconds of violent poetry. A few minutes later, the clerk returned with a small, clear plastic bag. It contained a tattered wallet, a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a single, tarnished brass key, and a folded, laminated card. Judge Wallace beckoned the clerk forward. "Bring that to me." The clerk handed the evidence bag up to the bench. The judge ignored the wallet and the book. His eyes were fixed on the card. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his robes and carefully unfolded the document. It was a military ID card, faded and worn at the edges, but still legible. He read the name printed on it, and the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place with the force of a rifle bolt locking in a battery. His breath caught in his throat. He looked from the card to the woman, and back again. He saw her not as she was now, in her ragged clothes, but as she must have been, in desert camouflage, her face grim with determination, leading a team of the most formidable warriors on the planet. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. Shame for himself, for the court, for a system that could allow such a person to fall so far, to be so utterly forgotten and disrespected. He slowly, deliberately, rose to his feet. It was a profound breach of judicial protocol. A judge never stands for anyone but the jury. But this was no longer a matter of protocol. It was a matter of honor. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with a reverence that silenced every rustle, every whisper, every breath in the room. "This court," he began, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with his robes and everything to do with his 40 years of naval service, "is in the presence of an American hero." He held up the laminated card for the entire court to see. "The defendant listed on this docket as Jane Doe," he announced, his voice booming with a command cadence he had learned on the bridge of a destroyer, "is Commander Anya Sharma." United States Navy. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The name meant nothing to most, but the rank, Commander, was a thunderclap that shattered every preconceived notion. Davies's face went from pale to ashen. A commander in the Navy, one step below captain, a rank achieved by only a tiny fraction of officers, a position of immense leadership and responsibility. The incongruity was staggering, but the judge was not finished. He began to read from the card, his voice a slow, deliberate litany of honor. "Last billet, Special Projects Team Leader, Naval Special Warfare Development Group." He paused, letting the words land. To the civilians, it was a mouthful of jargon. To the judge, and to any military personnel present, it was a sacred designation. DevGru, the elite of the elite, the unit popularly known as SEAL Team 6. The quiet professionals sent to the darkest corners of the world to do the impossible. The jury stared, their mouths agape, the caricature of the lazy vagrant dissolving before their eyes, replaced by an image of someone infinitely more complex and formidable. Significant awards, the judge continued, his voice growing thick with emotion as he read the citations that were abbreviated on the card, but whose meaning he knew by heart. The Navy Cross, he looked directly at Davies. Our nation's second highest award for valor in combat, awarded for extraordinary heroism. The Silver Star, with 2 oak leaf clusters, signifying 3 separate acts of gallantry in action. The Bronze Star, with Valor Device. 4 tours in Afghanistan, 3 in Iraq, 5 in undisclosed locations in the Horn of Africa and Southeast Asia. The Purple Heart, he let that last one hang in the air, a symbol of bloodshed for country. He lowered the card, his eyes locking with Commander Sharma's across the silent courtroom. For the first time, her expression shifted. A flicker of something, pain, memory, weariness, crossed her features before the mask of neutrality slipped back into place. Finally, Judge Wallace did something that no one in that room had ever seen before. He stood at his full height, faced the defendant's box, and brought his right hand up in a slow, precise, and perfect salute. It was not the gesture of a judge to a defendant. It was the salute of a rear admiral to a commander. It was the salute of one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of shared sacrifice, a profound apology, and an act of supreme public respect. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, from the back of the gallery, a man in a faded VFW cap slowly got to his feet and rendered his own salute. Then another, and another. Soon, every veteran in the room was standing, a silent honor guard for the forgotten hero they had almost condemned. Davies sank into his chair, utterly and completely defeated, not by a legal argument, but by the crushing weight of a truth he had been too arrogant to see. He had prosecuted a nuisance. He had insulted a legend. The story of what happened in Courtroom 4B spread with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. It began as a whisper in the courthouse hallways, a hushed, incredulous retelling by the clerks and bailiffs who had witnessed it. A young reporter for a local news blog, who had been in the room covering a different case, typed out a frantic, breathless account on his phone, and by the time the court was officially adjourned for the day, his post had been shared thousands of times. The headline was stark and irresistible. Homeless Jane Doe disarms gunman in court, revealed to be legendary Navy SEAL commander. The story hit the veteran community like a lightning strike. Military blogs, forums, and social media pages exploded. The grainy security footage of the takedown was inevitably leaked, and experts dissected the 2-second clip with a kind of reverent awe. They identified the specific CQC techniques, the perfect form, the utter lack of hesitation. It was, they agreed, a masterclass in controlled violence. The image of Judge Wallace, a retired 2-star admiral, saluting the disheveled woman in the defendant's box became an iconic symbol, a powerful visual representation of a nation's forgotten debt to its warriors. For Marcus Davies, the aftermath was a crucible of public humiliation and private shame. He was excoriated online, his arrogant courtroom pronouncements quoted verbatim alongside Commander Sharma's list of commendations. His office was flooded with furious calls and emails. But the external condemnation was nothing compared to his own internal reckoning. He replayed his words over and over in his mind. A burden on our city's resources, no discernible contribution, a life of bad choices. Each phrase was now a shard of glass in his conscience. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his judgment, so blind. A week later, he sought out Mr. Peterson, the public defender. He found him in the courthouse cafeteria, looking exhausted but vindicated. Davies approached the table, his usual swagger gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out humility. I wanted to apologize, Davies began, his voice low. Not to you, but to her. For what I said, for what I thought. Is there any way I can speak with her? Peterson looked at him for a long moment. She's not here, Marcus. A couple of guys from her old unit showed up the same day. They spirited her away to a private facility. They're taking care of their own, Davies nodded, a fresh wave of shame washing over him. The community she had served so faithfully had not forgotten her, even if the society she had protected had. He spent the next few months in deep reflection, and the experience fundamentally changed him. He quietly resigned from the DA's office and used his savings to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal services to homeless and struggling veterans, a silent, lifelong penance for his moment of profound ignorance. He had learned the hardest lesson of his life in that courtroom, that the measure of a person is not found in their appearance or their circumstances, but in the content of their character and the record of their actions. Commander Sharma, true to her nature, wanted none of the fame that followed the incident. The offers poured in: book deals, movie rights, lucrative speaking engagements, requests for television interviews. She refused them all, quietly and firmly. Her former teammates, grizzled, bearded men who moved with the same quiet deadliness she did, formed a protective barrier around her, shielding her from the sudden, intrusive glare of the media. They got her into the best treatment facility the VA had, a private, peaceful place in the mountains where she could finally begin to process the accumulated weight of a dozen combat deployments. The silence she had maintained in the courtroom was not arrogance. It was a symptom of a soul pushed to its absolute limit, a mind so overloaded with trauma that words had become meaningless. In the quiet solitude of the mountains, with the help of therapists who understood the unique burdens of the warrior class, she slowly began to heal. She never spoke of the courtroom incident, but its legend continued to grow without her. The story became a piece of institutional folklore. At the local police academy, new recruits were shown the security footage of her takedown not just as a lesson in technique, but as a lesson in humility. The instructor would pause the video on the image of her standing over the unconscious gunman. "Look at her," the instructor would say. "She doesn't look like a threat. She looks like someone you'd ignore, someone you dismiss." Never, ever make that mistake. Assume everyone is capable of anything. Respect is your default setting. Let them prove you wrong. Not the other way around. Courtroom 4B was unofficially christened the Commander's Court by the staff. A small, anonymous plaque appeared one day on the wall, just outside the door. It didn't bear her name. It simply read, "Fortitudine Vincimus. By endurance, we conquer," Judge Wallace had it made himself. It was the motto of the Shackleton expedition, a tribute to the silent, uncomplaining strength he had witnessed. Sharma herself found a new mission. After a few months of treatment, she began volunteering at a local veteran shelter. She didn't give speeches or run for the board of directors. She was just there quietly every day. She would sit with the newly homeless veterans, men and women hollowed out by the same wars that had nearly consumed her, and she would listen. She wouldn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She would just sit with them in their silence, sharing the burden, her calm presence a powerful anchor in their storm. She taught them not with words, but with her example, that dignity was not something that could be taken away by circumstance, that honor was carried within, and that the quiet work of putting one foot in front of the other was its own form of victory. The legend was of the courtroom hero. The reality was of the quiet healer, continuing her service far from any battlefield. A year later, Judge Wallace visited the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California. He had been invited as a guest of honor to speak to a graduating class of new SEAL candidates, the young tadpoles, who had survived the brutal crucible of BUD/S training. After his speech, a young officer escorted him to a specialized training facility on the base, a place known simply as the Annex. It was a place where the operational art of close-quarters combat was perfected. Inside, a small group of operators was running a live-fire drill in a meticulously recreated kill house. They moved with a terrifying grace, a symphony of controlled aggression. And leading them, her voice calm and authoritative over the comm system, was Commander Anya Sharma. She was no longer the disheveled woman from his courtroom. She wore clean, functional training gear. Her hair was tied back neatly, and her eyes, once clouded with a deep weariness, were now bright with focus and purpose. She wasn't just healed, she was home. Her community had not just rescued her, they had restored her. They had recognized that her greatest wound was not the loss of her home or her possessions, but the loss of her mission. So they gave her a new one, training the next generation of warriors, ensuring that the lesson she had learned in blood and sacrifice would be passed down. She saw the judge watching from the observation deck and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement before turning her attention back to the trainees. Her instruction was precise, minimalist, and brutally effective. Slower is smoother. Smoother is faster. She told a young SEAL whose movements were too jerky. Control your breathing. Control the space. The weapon is an extension of your will. If your will is chaotic, your rounds will be too. She was not just teaching them how to fight. She was teaching them her philosophy. The philosophy of the quiet professional. The idea that true mastery is silent, that competence speaks for itself, and that ego is a liability that gets you killed. The story of her trial had become a foundational myth for these new recruits. It was a stark reminder that the skills they were learning were not for show, that the warrior ethos extended far beyond the battlefield, and that the measure of their character would be how they conducted themselves when no one was watching, when they had nothing, when the world had written them off. The legend of Courtroom 4B was not about the dramatic takedown. It was about the quiet dignity that preceded it. It was about the strength to remain silent under a barrage of insults, the discipline to maintain composure in the heart of chaos, and the humility to never, ever believe that your worth is defined by the judgment of others. It had become a permanent part of the naval special warfare culture, a modern parable on the enduring power of quiet competence. The legacy of that single, chaotic afternoon in Courtroom 4B was not a statue in a park or a building named in someone's honor. It was a living, breathing thing, a quiet but profound shift in the culture of the institutions it had touched. For the city's justice system, it served as a permanent, humbling reminder. This Sharma rule became an informal policy among the public defenders and a cautionary tale for the prosecutors. It was a simple principle. Look beyond the file, beyond the clothes, beyond the circumstances. Every person who entered the courtroom had a history, a story that the charge sheet could never capture. The rule didn't change the laws, but it changed the way people saw each other, injecting a much-needed dose of humility and empathy into the adversarial system. Marcus Davies' nonprofit flourished, becoming a model for veteran outreach programs across the country. He never saw Commander Sharma again, but he carried her lesson with him every day. He had learned that justice was not merely about applying the law, but about seeing the humanity in those who stood before it. His work became his tribute, his quiet, lifelong apology. For the United States Navy, Commander Sharma became a new kind of icon. She was not a hero because of the medal she had won, but because of the battle she had survived after the wars were over. She represented the institution's highest ideals and also its greatest failure, the failure to care for its warriors when they return home broken. Her story prompted a massive overhaul of the military's transitional and mental health programs for veterans, with a new emphasis on proactive, long-term support. Her legacy was written into policy, ensuring that future generations of service members would have a safety net that had not been there for her. And for Commander Sharma herself, her legacy was in the faces of the young SEALs she trained. She had come full circle from the apex of the warrior hierarchy to the absolute bottom of society, and had climbed her way back not through fame or fortune, but through the steady, quiet application of her core principles. She taught her students that the ultimate expression of strength was not the power to destroy, but the discipline to control oneself. True legacy, she showed them, wasn't what you left behind in a record book. It was the standard of excellence that continued forward in the actions of those you inspired. It was the quiet competence, the unwavering calm, the profound and unshakable belief that your worth is proven not by what you say, but by what you do. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over ignorant prejudice and where silent discipline defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.